Hey, welcome everybody.
Yeah.
It's a great turnout. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. As part of Veterans Month 2017, this is one of many really exciting events that have been organized by a lot of people, but I always give a shout out to Tiffany Rivera at the back there. Today we have a book talk by Dr. Barbara Gannon, my esteemed colleague and friend. You may know that Barb has a first book that was an award-winning book. It was an honorable mention for the Lincoln Prize. It was the winner of the Wiley Silver Award for Best First Book, University of Mississippi. And it was a third award, wasn't it?
The finalist for the Jefferson Davis Prize, which was too weird for words.
That was the one I wanted to remember. Finalist for the Jefferson Davis Prize, as she said, which is too weird for words, but there you go. And that was The One Cause, Black and White Comradeship in the Grand Army of the Republic. She's here today because she already has another book out, and this is a really valuable work for all of us who study memory, collective memory, social memory. It's so much in the news today, right? Every day we're looking at the struggles over the commemoration of events in our past, particularly Civil War right now, and the struggle surrounding that. This is a book that I'm going to use in my spring class because it does such a good job of explaining memory. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Memory, and she's going to tell you about her new book, which is, very simply, Americans Remember Their Civil War. Dr. Barbara Gannon.
Thank you. Actually, when I called my press, when I heard about the Jefferson Davis Prize, the person at UNC Press said, I don't think I've ever heard anyone who had an honorable mention for the Lincoln Prize and got anywhere near the Jefferson Davis Prize. It was kind of an odd combination. Just get my tech. There you go. Okay. It was June 2015. I guess you would say the waning days of the waning days of the Civil War centennial. The governor of South Carolina, an Indian American woman, asked the legislature to approve measures that would take down and remove the Confederate flag from near the State House grounds. The Civil War began in South Carolina, and it would be nice to think that it would end there, at least the battle for Civil War memory, and it came down a few weeks later, and there's a picture of it before the State House, and there's the state troopers removing it. This victory seemed hollow, though. 9 African-American men and women, grandmothers, pastors, and others gunned down as they prayed in a historic Charleston church. That single act prompted this request. The accused shooter's social media accounts demonstrated his devotion to white supremacy and a lost cause, Confederate Civil War memory. In response to these actions, other states rejected Confederate symbols. The lost cause came under attack in places as varied as Stone Mountain, Georgia, home to the largest statuary of the lost cause, Bowdoin College in Maine, with its Jefferson Davis Prize. Another skirmish in the seemingly endless war fought earlier this year in Charlottesville. A single white woman died facing down white supremacists who came to defend the Lee Monument in that city. From Charleston to Charlottesville, the contest over Civil War memory continues. Now, after Charleston, it wasn't the only thing that was taken down because it was done so quietly. Baltimore took their statues down in the middle of the night. And Baltimore is very interesting because it was a Union state, Maryland, but it had a strong Confederate presence, and the Confederate Civil War memory was very strong there. But they decided to avoid the issue altogether and just take them down when no one saw it being done. When Nobel Prize winner William Faulkner proclaimed, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," he might have been speaking about Americans remembering their Civil War. Nothing else explains why Americans contest the Civil War and its memory more than 150 years after the war ended. Now, to understand this, you have to understand memory. Now, memory is what individuals remember. You and I remember what happened to us. But it's also about how people come together to make sense of what they remember, collective memory. And it's about what people remember even when they don't remember. For example, 150 years ago, after the Civil War, we still remember it, which is, I guess, an odd way of saying. Now, to understand how this happened, a lot of people have written individual books, and my goal was to sort of put it all together again. It's a very complex process that took studying from 1866 until now. Now, first thing you have to understand is memory, which has a lot of theories. Though most of it, a lot of it's is done by sociologists, so historians often didn't pay much attention. So I decided to sort of simplify, there's lots of different terms for it, into what to one school said. I then examined what historians had said about Civil War memory. Because right now, there's a lot in the past 20 years, a lot has been written, and even before that, about how Americans remembered the war. Now, the interesting issue, though, with Southern Civil War memory and Northern Civil War memory is they're not exactly the best terms, because there were Confederate supporters, or at least people who thought the Confederacy had the right idea in the North. And in the South, there were many people who supported the Union and its cause. So I tried to keep it to, but it wasn't always successful, Confederates and Federal Civil War memory, or a Union or United States Civil War memory. It's interesting because historians always say, well, no one agreed on the memory of the Civil War. And I'm like, well, how could they? In the beginning, they disagreed during the war and what happened and why it happened. It'd be surprising if everyone agreed in its aftermath. Especially problematic, I think, is that everyone has said Confederate memory is Southern memory. And you can only say that if you conflate Southern with white, because many Southern African Americans had very different memories. Unless you don't consider them Southerners, though they were born in the South, and for a very long time, a lot of people had that view. Now, when I looked at this, I looked at particularly historical memory. There'll be two kinds of memory I'm talking: collective, which is how you make sense. Individuals make sense of things that happen to them. And then there's historical memory. And what I found there was, historical memory is the memory of people who didn't live through the events. So you have the people who lived through it and tried to make sense by getting together in groups, and I'll talk about those groups. In historical memory, the next generation, us. And what they did was, when they remembered the war, they tended to select the collective memory that suited their present purposes. Now, the end of the 19th century, until well after the Civil Rights Movement, Southern, or Confederate more properly, memory dominated American life. That was the Civil War memory. Even Union supporters, Northerners, accepted that. This didn't really break until the Civil Rights Movement, to some extent. A little before it, some scholars began to question how correct that memory was. And definitely until a very long time after the Civil Rights Movement had its first successes in the 60s, people began to remember the Civil War in different ways. I mean, I think the most interesting thing about this is what I haven't seen in the debate. People always talk about how Southerners remember the war. Northerners definitely had a way of remembering the war, but no one even studied that or even cared about it until the 21st century. And that only managed to happen because people noticed things like, I was hearing someone talk, black troops in the Civil War. When they remembered black troops, then they started remembering that the war had something to do with freedom and later union. So you have the Southern Civil War, the lost cause, which ironically won in many ways. It certainly won in America for decades of the 20th century, and only later did people really start to think about what did Union soldiers, Northerners, Federalist supporters, whatever you want to call them, believe they were fighting for. And it's really only then, after the Civil Rights Movement and people remembered black military service, did the Union cause make any headway. The first book really that addressed it formally was in 2005. So we all know, let's talk about memory. We all know memory, individual memory, how you remember things that actually happened to you. Mostly though, we're going to talk about how groups remember, but there's not that big a difference. Collective memory is how a group of people who've lived through an event come together to make sense of it. Historical memory relates to people who have no individual memory. Now, they're not interchangeable. Those historians have used that. One of the most important things I tried to come to in this book was to divide the Civil War generation from the next generations, because that's very important. Now, there's also a couple terms I'll use: public memory and historical and popular memory. Public memory is, you've seen it, that's public memory right there, monuments and battlefields that are preserved. Popular memory, I bet you know that real well: movies, TV, novels. In one way, that's a separate memory, but in many ways, they all build on each other. Now, all memory, historic, collective, public, or popular, and this is where it becomes tricky, is the past and the present. When you remember something, if it happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or someone told you or you read a book about a past historical event, everything you're understanding is really about the now. You're taking that memory and you're understanding it to who you are today. And that is all memory, even just individual memory. I often tell my students, think of it this way: if you were looking back at college 30 years ago and remembering it, I'm not saying it'll be inaccurate, but it'll be very much about who you are then and who you've been since in your life since that date. Collective memory is no different. Now, when you do remember, and let's go back to Civil War people, because that's where we have to sort of start this. You don't remember an event, even if it happened yesterday, in any way, but based on how society almost tells you you can remember it. So let's think of it this way. You have an amputee after the war. And when he remembers what happened to him, either immediately or the years after, he was told that a man should be whole, that a man should have certain attitudes toward pain and suffering, even in the antebellum era. When it happens to him and later, he remembers it through these ideas of how society tells him he can remember it. He can't remember it like in a way that would challenge his manhood and his understanding of it. Women who are widows, the same thing happens there. A woman has certain expectations in the antebellum era. She loses her husband. Many of those are challenged if she has to take care of the farm. And in the aftermath of the war, she, even though she has this understanding of herself as a woman, some of those things may have changed because of her experience in the war. So you have this social and political context which shapes how people remember anything. For example, how many times have we read something as scholars or Civil War historians and said, well, this man isn't saying all the agony and pain was in, because the man won't talk like that, will he? He's not going to bleed out in his diary or letters home how terrible it was, because that's not what a man does. Now, what complicates our story is things like these statues. And they complicate our memory because women were very much at the forefront of this. After the war, women, particularly in the South, who had lived through the war, who had suffered or supported it, they actually, oddly enough, become the champions of Confederate Civil War memory, the lost cause. So like most, you know how we always say, well, it's his story, that's about men, his. This is very much a her story. So after the war, women remembered what had happened to them in relationship to what a woman, a Southern woman, a planter's wife, a white woman would experience. But after the war, you're going to see a very interesting shift where these women get very political related to Civil War memory. So both sides, I talk mainly about the women and the lost cause, but also the Northern cause, the Union cause. I write about Union veterans. They both created a collective memory of what happened to them. Whether they wrote books or made speeches or built monuments, they had an idea that they wanted to hand to the next generation about what happened to them. So both sides are very aware, and if you read what they say, they're very aware that they're almost in this contest that is about who won the war in memory. They're very aware Southerners don't want certain things remembered about their war effort, and Northerners want certain things remembered about theirs. So, when I talk about collective and historical memory, the women are very key. I'll give you a perfect example of that. The women after the war had to bury the dead in the South, and they were called the Ladies' Memorial Associations. Their daughters became the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which are very key to our monument debate today. They built the monuments that you see. I guarantee you that was a UDC monument, that are all over the countryside that people are challenging. So keep in mind women as I discuss this. So, we have the Civil War generation fighting to come to terms with all the terrible things that happened to them, to find some meaning in their cause, find some meaning in their sacrifice. Imagine a Southern widow woman who never got her husband's body home. After the war, she builds a monument. They build a monument to him in the community, and they try to make sense of what happened to them. The same thing happens in the North. The women and men try to make sense of this catastrophe that happened to them and how it should be remembered. So they die, eventually pass on, but they've created a lot of what one might call archives of memory or artifacts of memory. And the next generation comes along. They didn't live through the war. But when they think of the war, they have to think about what they're thinking about, and it's not like, well, I'm thinking about my present. What do I like best about the Civil War? What fits? No one's thinking that consciously. They're living in the present, and they look back, and historians are kind of the referees in this. They make some of the decisions. Oh, that collective memory is more useful. That collective memory is more useful. Wait a minute, that resonates with me. And oddly enough, for the first half of the 20th century, the lost cause resonated with people. And that's very important. And there are a lot of the collective memory of the lost cause was enshrined in archives like the Southern Historical Society, and in memoirs, and in biographies, and in statues. And the Northern side did not do as well in that area. Now, the first generation after the Civil War, even its historians, they were dealing with a lot of issues. One, let's talk about, is the industrial age. And people are feeling anxious about this industrial society they're coming to. So at the end of the 1900s, people were saying, well, are men manly? Well, of course men are manly. Look at the Civil War. And you're thinking, well, of course they looked at the Civil War. They looked at the blue and the gray. Oddly enough, they often highlighted the gray. The gray, the Confederate forces were more manly. Because they lost, they were seen as more heroic, more romantic. They had a more romantic narrative. If you wanted to unite the nation for World War I, what memory are you going to remember? Are you going to embrace a memory where both sides were equal and heroic? Or are you going to remember what Unionists often remembered, which was that the war was about slavery and disunion, and weren't they terrible people in the South? The lost cause was so much better for that. And all of this is played out against race. This is where I take a slightly different pitch from other people. A book about the same period was called Race and Reunion, and it connected these things. The fact that Americans were Southerners had achieved many racist acts at the end of the 19th century, 1895, Plessy versus Ferguson. They had disenfranchised African Americans, and this was related and caused almost by the way Civil War was being remembered. If people had remembered slavery, if they had not accepted the lost cause, that this would have been different. Well, my thing is race is very essential to mine. White people were happy racist, and they all agreed on that, if nothing else. So they all agreed and had the same ideas about race. And when they remembered the Civil War, it had to do with everything else going on in the nation. So let's imagine this. This is how I set it up in the book. Imagine a World War I soldier who found inspiration in former Confederates' heroism, even if his grandfather had fought for the Union. The President of the United States is Woodrow Wilson. He wrote history books, and even though he would talk about slavery, and slavery is the cause of the war, his whole line was Confederates were the most heroic Americans that ever were. And that's what people read and believed. Now, as I go through time, I looked at how other events might have affected Civil War memory. And I found that, well, you're saying, well, after the war was over, people didn't feel the same way. No, they didn't. In the 30s, particularly, people felt, the 20s and 30s, there were progressive historians who thought, this industrial nation is oppressive. It's terrible to workers. Where did this industrial nation come from? It's because we won the Civil War. An agrarian society was destroyed. And that's a terrible thing, because this industrial society that rose is so much worse than that agrarian society. And that echoed lost cause thoughts. And then after World War I, Americans decided war was a bad idea. So they said to themselves, well, if war is a bad idea, why particularly are we losing all these white lives for black people? And that would definitely line up with the lost cause version of the Civil War. So through all these decades, up to World War II, the lost cause seemed to serve American interests way better than the Union cause, which was about saying that a certain segment of the United States were traitors and that they held slaves. Now, as time goes on, things change. Say you had the granddaughter of the person who fought in World War I lives to see the Civil Rights Movement. And maybe she remembers, or begins to remember, a war that was about freeing the slaves, and something that should be remembered and applied to today, and the struggles to end segregation and disenfranchisement. Then maybe her daughter, one of the things I talk about in the book is, they found the role of women, and they remembered the role of women in the Civil War, and her daughter becomes a historian and finds that fact because she's affected by the present movement to give women more of a status in society. So what you find is the historical memory of the Civil War, when no one remembers it, is often about a current issue, whether it be war, or a union, or women, or race. And I say race doesn't matter in the first half of the 20th century because Americans all agreed. They agreed on the inferiority of African Americans. And so they did remember the war was about slavery, but they didn't much care. They had other agendas. Now, so having established the sort of collective and historical. Let's go back to what is the memory. Because this is often a subject of dispute. This is the two sides. And if you look at current events, one thing you'll notice is you don't hear much about the other. So there was definitely a lost cause, and there's been lots of books written about that. And there's definitely a Union cause, and there's not been hardly anything written about that. If you're going to write a book about Civil War memory, you do prefer your chapter on the Union cause because you have less to read. That's only a very recent development. A Confederate remembered when they thought of the war at the time, they remembered this wrong-headed effort of the federal government to stop peaceful succession. Now people say, well, they remembered tariffs, so the war wasn't about slavery, but that's what Southerners, first thing they remember is you were wrong to stop secession. And that was enforcing your military will on the Southern people. Then, if they remember before the war, we didn't fight for slavery, but this whole thing was started by abolitionists who caused trouble with our slaves. And oh, by the way, our slaves are very faithful. And they wouldn't have listened to these people. So, because you're causing so much trouble for our faithful slaves, we have to have our own independent nation, which we had a right to. When the war was over, with this memory, they rejected any idea of the war, that they were wrong. Why would you think you're wrong? Now you're saying, well, they didn't think they were wrong because they had this advanced constitutional theory, and I read, very boring, Alexander Stevens' version of what they call the war between the states. But more importantly, if you've lost your son, your husband, two sons, your husband and two sons, and everything, you won't even say, oh, we were wrong. Oh my God, I can't believe how stupid we were, that was for nothing. No one's going to say that, ever. So you get this sort of, this sets up very soon after the war. This whole idea, and it's understandable, no one's going to say they were wrong. Union, and this is the one less known, as federal supporters were very, 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 very clear. They had fought to save the Union, but more importantly, to suppress the rebellion. If you want to see some memory that from the northern side that's forgotten is the idea that Southerners were, Confederate supporters were traitors. That's really lost, even more than any idea of slavery. But they remembered, they preserved the Union, they freed the slaves. Northern veterans and Northerners who supported the federal government were as racist as anyone, but they didn't think you should own people. And they were very clear on that. They had created a nation of free men and women. So, these different memories they created, and created archives and monuments and wrote books, how they resonate with the present matter. What was the present problem? And you had, whether it was veterans organizations, way more important in the North than the South, women's organizations, way more important in the South, Secret Confederacy than it was in the Union supporters. They articulated a memory, and there's no suggestion that they were wrong, and no one's going to do this. If you think of all the blood and suffering of this Union, of the Civil War, no one on either side would accept the notion that they had somehow made a mistake. And particularly, let's go back to Confederate supporters. Their society is destroyed. They remembered brave men and women who had perished for a noble cause. What else were they going to remember? It had to be a noble cause. They used their collective memory to make sense of having to rebuild their society. Yes, a society based on racial and white supremacy. But what else was it going to be? That's what they were. They believed in white supremacy during the war and afterwards. Because people always say, well, the Confederate cause is about white supremacy. Yes, it is. Because the Confederate society, and Southern society, was about white supremacy. And it was about white supremacy into the 20th century, and so was the Northern, many Northern societies. Now, Loyalists, though, Unionists, felt the same way. They didn't feel any different, and this has been again lost. They thought that they had fought and suffered for the right to save the Union and free the slaves. And what's interesting here is what's really lost is African Americans were players in this. African Americans hadn't forgotten they were in the Civil War. In some ways, while the North and the South are all agreeing with the lost cause, it's black historians and African Americans that keep alive the notion that the war was about slavery and that disunion was wrong. You can see that in the 20s and 30s and 40s, particularly with historians like W.B. Du Bois. So there's this huge contest going on. There's some, by the way, UBC women who putting up this statue to John H. Morgan, who raided the North in Ohio, in Lexington, Kentucky. And the trick here is Lexington, Kentucky, that isn't a Union state. So the UBC is even in what was Union states, building Confederate memorials. So there they are, and that's a very common picture. That's a very common state. And remember, these monuments were not built right after the war. They are built by the next generation. This isn't Union. No one ever talks about Union monuments. This is a beautiful monument in Indianapolis. There are Union monuments all over the country. I saw one in Hartford. It has an African American on it. The one in Cleveland has an African American on it. These are Union monuments to the Union memory. And if you went and you attended one of the memorials, they would say, we fought the traitors, we defeated secession, we saved the Union, they very rarely said preserved, and freed the slaves. We brought freedom to 4 million of the Chatham. Some version of how they freed 4 million slaves. So they have a definite idea. These are African Americans on parade in New York for Memorial Day. I believe this is like 1910, 1913. As long as the Civil War generation lived, they fought for their version of Civil War memory. So up to, say, 1913, you definitely still have some, the Civil War generation is making its point, whether it be Southern, Confederate, see even I slip into that, Confederate, Federal, or a subset of Federal memory, not opposed to it, African Americans. Now this is the 1913 reunion again. This is where you see it crossing into generations. I read all the newspapers on this. This is about union and reunion and Americans coming together, blue and gray, reunionism, what some Union soldiers call gush, romance, sentimentalism. We're all brave Americans. But if you read that stuff, it's written by the next generation in newspapers who want to advocate a national reunion. We are now a world power. We have colonies overseas. We want to be a world power, all Americans of both sections. And explain why a lot of this is going to take momentum. This is a 1917 Confederate reunion in Washington, D.C. And if you'll notice, the Confederate flag is way in front of the Union. The Confederate flag is in front of the U.S. flag. This is a monument to reunion done at the time of the First World War. So you get the First World War, it's much more useful a memory to say, well, we were all heroic, brave Americans, almost subsuming the word white in there. So, ironically, because of the fact that the lost cause served so well, it dominates American memory. And a lot of that, again, is it just served everyone's interests so much better. And this goes back to, oddly enough, the memory of slavery. So people said, well, you're writing about the memory of the Civil War. But the memory of the Civil War, as I found, is hinged on slavery. Americans thought slavery was a benevolent institution for inferior people, and they believed this well into the 60s and 70s. Now, if you believe slavery is a benevolent institution, you either A, don't think the lost cause was wrong, Or B, think the whole war idea was wrong in the first place. Why did you try to free people who either were faithful and didn't want to be free, or didn't need to be free because they weren't competent enough? And that was the American psychology, and one of the reasons why the Lost Cause did so well. The Union cause reminded you of abolitionists who were the troublemakers. The Union cause reminded you that whites had fought for black rights, which no one wanted to be reminded of. And if you believed that slavery was a benevolent institution, its defenders were romantic, honorable people. And that was the American view of the Civil War, and I studied the textbooks for a very long time, well after the Civil Rights Movement. Now, after World War II, I said this thing falls apart. And I think it has to do with World War II, two things. One, World War II proved that racism leads to genocide. Many people served, even if they weren't in the same unit because of segregation, and African Americans served in World War II. So there was a generation who came of age, who had fought for freedom and against racism with African Americans. And African Americans went to school in the GI Bill and became historians, and all of those things happened. But also there's the Cold War. In the Cold War, I don't do a very good Russian accent, but the communists would say, you know, you Americans, you talk about freedom all the time. What about your colored people? What about your colored people? Is that democracy? We say, our colored people. Oh yeah, like those. And a lot of people who saw it in the Cold War light that we really need to do something about race. But this is only a crack. This isn't everywhere. When the centennial comes, the 100th anniversary, in 1960, before the Civil Rights Movement really takes off, they're still into the lost cause. We all are brothers. We all love each other. We're all brave Americans. But it's going to take time to crack that. And it does happen. But it's almost, here's the issue with Civil War memory. Historians wrote textbooks, and they wrote the Civil War they had learned as children. 30 years ago, the lost cause is triumphant. When I traced it in textbooks, I found the lost cause is very powerful into the 70s, almost 80s. That version of the Civil War, that version of slavery. So you have, because of the way history is transmitted, the lost cause is very successful. And it doesn't help that you have public history, monuments, but really I think battlefield parks are much more important, that often pitch the reconciliationist version. You go to Gettysburg and you see what they do, Pickett's Charge, heroic Americans dying. Those heroic Americans were facing Pennsylvanians, who I don't think in 1875 would have the same warm feeling. If you go, so there is, even at our monuments and our public parks, even though lately the public parks have tried to bring slavery into the war, they run into a lot of opposition. But really, more than that, it's movies. Really, movies. What are the two biggest movies ever done in American history? The biggest bestsellers, popular acclaim movies ever. Gone with the Wind and
Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation. That is what Americans, I know it's going to be hard to believe, they don't just sit around reading Civil War books all day. Now, what they did was, a lot of Americans, and this was kind of a question, these Civil War movies were not successful because everyone said, I got to see the Lost Cause version of the Civil War, let me go. They said, Matt, did you? Clark Gable, Vivian Lee, isn't it romantic? So people went to it, but that becomes their Civil War memory. What else do they? You think you remember some? How many people read your history textbooks? Well, not the historians, and yeah, Laura, you don't count. Your future historian. But people watch movies. Later, when things start to turn, you get a documentary like Civil War. And Civil War kind of had the end of the 20th century truce. There were elements of reunion, like Shelby Foote. They had an African-American PhD talking about the African-American view of the war, emancipation. But you still had a lot of reunion. It ends. How does it end? everyone meets at Gettysburg in 1913 and shakes hands. So this is an enormously resilient myth. And the Union Northern cause certainly wasn't. And it's pervaded through textbooks and movies and battlefields and everyone else that thinks that this is way more useful to remember Americans fighting and dying, if not together, at least as brave Americans. So when I studied it, what struck me was that it's not surprising, even though in the 21st century people say there's been many, many challenges to the lost cause, but it's still very powerful. That people still accept the monuments as part of our history and don't want to take them down because they'll say it's our history. And somewhat as a Union causist, I'm like, well, what do you mean part of our history? Our history is the United States history. It's not the failed nation, the Confederacy, but they've been told for decades that it's our history. So when people are asked, should we take the monument down? They say, no, it's our history. But our history is also the fact that Unionists, federal supporters, even when they were very racist, believed that they had fought and suffered to preserve the Union, to save it, and to create a new Union, and they always said this, of free men and women. And as I say, none of this really matters. It only matters because of places like Charleston and Charlottesville. We still seem to be fighting the Civil War. We still seem to be dealing with the ramifications 150 years after it's over. It's memory. And I think its memory is about now. I think Charleston was about now, whether it is angst about globalization or was reaction to the first black president or whatever. Whatever we have now, we have seen the great myth of American history and life, the Civil War, and we're interpreting it for who and what we are today. As we've always done. It's the central myth. In the book, I talked about how this one historian talked about the Civil War as the American Iliad. Well, I called the Civil War memory the American Odyssey. It's a journey that we've been coming home now for 150 years and we still haven't come to terms with. And even though in my book I talk about a lot of things, it's about the fact that he went into a historically African American church that was key both before and after the Civil War and the freedom struggle and butchered those people. Because it does always come back to race in a strange way. But because we've just accepted a lot of racial ideas, such as the benevolence of slavery, and that the war, that the sacrifice of white Americans on an opposing side, even an opposing side that was trying to destroy the nation, is more valiant and honorable than that of African Americans who served in our side and under our flag. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Jim,
When did the Confederate battle flag become the Confederate flag?
Okay, a friend of mine, Gary Gallagher, wrote a book about this. And he showed that in 19th century art, the battle flag is whatever. I mean, it's there, but it's not the centerpiece. And he showed how in modern art, if you had a Confederate scene, it was the centerpiece. The Confederate battle flag, and this is why people get so angry at it, generally was resurfaced by the Klan, but then it really resurfaced as official memory when it was adopted into Southern states' flags in the 1950s as a conscious way of saying segregation, you can put in whatever you want. It was a way of fighting symbolically segregation. So if you had a Southern flag, you see those Southern flags of earlier, they don't have the battle flag so square. And Jim brings up a good point. The battle flag was not the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag had many iterations, and that was only, St. Andrew's Cross was part of it. That is the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. And that was the symbol of, in its modern incarnation, is very much tied to resistance to segregation. Excuse me, to integration. It was after the Brown versus the Board decision in '54, when the southern states said, heck no, they put Confederate flags back. And that's why, bizarrely, Americans associate the Confederacy with segregation. It probably doesn't seem so odd to us, but it does. But that's how it happened. It wasn't, people say, well, the war was about slavery, but they forget the interim was the flag went away. It came back for the struggle against integration and the federal efforts to integrate, whether it be schools or buses or Woolworth counters or whatever. Yes?
Did you see the difference in places like Atlanta, where Sherman had more of a territorial warfare approach, so it was attacking the civilian populations?
Well, what's interesting is Atlanta, I lived there. I know it very well. Atlanta believed in one thing. Atlanta believes in money. It was built as a merchant city. Actually, Atlanta had very little trouble with civil rights. They just went along with the program because they figured out it would make them money. Now, you do have in Atlanta Stone Mountain. If you've ever seen Stone Mountain, imagine Mount Rushmore for the Confederacy. I mean, it's huge. Jeff Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. It's huge. And I go, when I used to live there, I used to go and snarl at it. But it's huge. They don't know what to do with it. There's nothing you can do other than blast the mountain. But Sherman is part of it. But here's an interesting thing about Sherman. Right after the war, Sherman was seen as a conservative on racial, and he was, on racial issues. So they didn't hate him right away. They came to hate him in the 1880s and 90s. But initially he wasn't as hated because of that. But as everyone knows, Sherman March in memory is hysterical. Did you know every town in Georgia was burned by Sherman? It was a very big army of 62,000. He managed to burn every town. Now, he was only on a very narrow path between Atlanta and Savannah, but every town was burned. And they were witnesses. Well, their grandpappy told them. And they burned the puppy and everything. Now, that town, if you look at the map, is in like southwest Georgia and was nowhere near Sherman. Sherman in memory did so much more than in reality. I'm sure he'd be proud of himself.
John and then Rose.
Can I ask you a question about method? I mean, when you think about this, compare this to your first book, now you're doing a book that really verges up on current events. So, in fact, while you're writing this, you go from Middle Roof to Charlottesville to memorials being torn down. As a historian, when we think about critical distance from our subject area, how do you handle that as a historian?
Okay, the first book was about the 19th century. I did bring it up a little bit. The epilogue talked about events in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but it was about the Grand Army Republic, the Union Army's largest veterans organization. I talked about its black and white members and their relationship, which was much better than anyone had ever thought. Because they remembered the war was about freeing slaves, and they talked about it constantly. As a historian, there's a point where you go, you know, I have way too many notes on that, I could just shut up. Really, I did that at one point. Talking about slavery all the time. Proud of you, but really. So I did that was very much a monograph. It was so steeped in primary sources, you would just die. So they came to me, Prager, and they said, okay, we want a synthetic work on we want Civil War memory in 75,000 words. And I went, all of it. 1866 till now? Now it was like 2013, okay. All right, that's not, okay, I can do that. How hard can that be? By the way, it's really hard. Because there's a gap where no one writes about Civil War memory. People don't care about it in the 20th century much. Until they discovered the lost cause right after Vietnam. And I really do attribute that to people being cynicized by Vietnam and looking back on the myths of American history and finding it as a myth. They would call it the myth of the lost cause. So what I did was I started out, I did the Union and the Confederate cause based on what historians had said, synthetic work. So I get to the 20th century after World War II and I go, there's nothing here. But what I realized was historians were reflecting what Americans felt. So I talked about the nationalist school that wanted reunion. I talked about Southerners and the Dunning School and their historians who advocated the lost cause. I talked about people who thought after World War I all wars were bad. how could we spend so many lives? And the understated thing was freeing black people. And so I did it that way. So I did this, there wasn't a lot during the Cold War. Graduate students, there was nothing. So I kind of pieced that together, talked about the way history was going. I got to the centennial, thank God, nice book. I wrote about the centennial, the 100 years. And then I said, well, I told them I'd do it up to the 21st century. What do I do? So what I did there was I talked about what historians are talking about in the Civil War now, the dark turn, the fact that it was terrible. So I'm writing this, and I did one draft, and it was just sent off before Charleston. And so, okay, so I work Charleston, it becomes the whole center of the book. So I rewrite, and I bring it from Charleston, and that becomes the centerpiece. And then I send it off, I check the camera proofs, which anyone who's publishing knows, and Charleston, and Charlottesville happens. Like the next day. Seriously. Charleston happened a day after I sent one draft, and Charlottesville the day after I went through the camera proofs. So I dealt with it, but the whole point was, I don't think it was different. It is current events. But my whole point, as I trace through the book, is the Civil War after the Civil War generation has nothing to do with the Civil War. It's always a myth that people, when they look back on it, they don't look on what happened, they look at the collective memory created by various groups, whether it's the UDC, the GAR, not as much, but some, the memory of Lincoln, the memory of Lee. What does serve their present time? If it's war, it's reunion. Even though one of the most famous World War I posters is for African Americans, Lincoln looking on as African Americans stormed the trench. They invoked it there. But whatever was useful. And it was about the current time, and that's about the current time. Really, I mean, okay, I'm not Lee's biggest fan. Really, Lee, Nazis, I thought Lee's going to come out of his grave and start beating up on those people. Lee would never be a Nazi. I didn't like him. He ain't no Nazi. That was about Nazis and modern alt-right and white supremacists. It has nothing to do with the Civil War. Is it understandable that people want to take the monument down? Absolutely. And in the book I say it's the communities. But those people weren't responding to Lee, they were using Lee. And that's that's just my view. This is all about now. Memory is about now. Except for the generation, and it was about now for them, but it was more about dealing with the wretched post-war life they led. Because of the fact their generation, both Northern and Southern Confederate Unionists, had been destroyed by the Civil War. It was coming to terms with that. But later people find purposes for their memories.
I think we have time for one more question, and Rose had her hand up, so.
So my question actually segues very nicely after John's and what you just said. And that is, I was going to ask you, as a historian, if you're asked now, so the Confederate monument in Lake Eola Park downtown in Orlando was just taken down.
Cleverly, they avoided this. Thank you very much.
They're putting it up in the cemetery.
Yes.
I just heard the sexton of the cemetery talking about it a couple weeks ago. But what do you as a historian say when all of your neighbors ask what you think should be done? And I actually saw a next door neighborhood discussion, and oh my goodness, it was like a really fascinating discussion. But again, to get to this notion of what do we as historians do and say with what's happening today in conversations about what is appropriate to happen with the monuments.
I say two things, and this gets me into somewhat trouble. It's up to the communities. They have to decide. It's not, historians act like they own all the land in the United States and all the monuments. Communities own the land, they control the space. They control the monuments. But I also do this. This is my magic wand. See my magic wand? I did this in a class last week. I was talking about my book. Okay, you can solve one problem in the United States of America that will make it better. Would the first thing you do get rid of Confederate monuments? No. So I asked the class, would the 50th thing you do be Confederate monuments? And the kids went, I said, you're thinking about the 50th thing. I mean, I don't like the Confederate monuments. I really have very strong opinions about Civil War memory. But I fundamentally know, as someone who knows it's about the present, that you have to deal with the present issues that are occurring and that they're just grabbing their little bit of Confederate memory or Union memory or whatever, mostly Confederate, that suits them. The problem has to be solved. But I honestly, if people say just because no, but they do belong to the communities. Orlando made that decision. New Orleans pulled them down. Baltimore snuck them out in the middle of the night. Now, where I object is when states, and there have been laws passed where states do not allow the local areas to make the decision. That I object to. That's what people in like Mississippi are running into. There's a state law saying you cannot remove it. But I think it's up to the local communities. And I trace how these were very much phenomenons of the local communities. So, I mean, some people it's not strong enough, but, you know, me, I always say, well, a little bit of C4 at the base. Sorry. But that's not, you know what I mean? People have to decide what they want. It's not our, but let's work on, if you really want to make a difference, register people to vote, educate people. I got 1,000 things I can say more than taking up that dumb statue of Robert E. Lee. Traitor that he is. Okay, that was last.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you.